If you are a people pleaser, if you struggle to set boundaries, if you always seek external validation, if you battle Sunday scaries, if you get anxiety going into Monday, if any of this resonates with you, you are going to love today's conversation with Dr. Laura B. She is a Gen Z and millennial psychologist. She specifically focuses on anxiety, stress, and people pleasing, specifically the people pleaser doctor. So, Dr. Laura B., welcome to Fulfilled.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you. We're going to cover some awesome topics that I personally need to learn from. So, first off, how can we tell if we're a people pleaser, especially maybe in a workplace setting? What are some signs?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of different signs that we can be looking for. So, one that's just a classic telltale sign of being a people pleaser is if we say yes before we really think.
Mm,
And so I think that's especially true at work, right? Where people pleasers might find themselves as the person that has like 10 different projects that they've said yes to, but none of them are necessarily ones that are meeting their needs. And so that's also, I think, like number two, one of the big things to look out for is if you're really beginning to feel burnt out and maybe you're really worried about disappointing someone else. And so you end up having this kind of imbalance where you're prioritizing other people's needs over your own. That's sometimes that telltale sign. And I think what's really difficult in work, and I see this a lot with my Gen Z and millennial clients that I work with, is that there's that sense of, well, I'm just starting my career, or, maybe I'm 5 years in, I'm 10 years in. I don't really have the latitude yet to really find my voice. Like, if there's a project, I have to be the person that says yes. Like, that is something that I need to do in order to get ahead or to not get laid off. There's usually a bunch of different, like, worst case scenarios that can play out of like what might happen if I say no. And I think what's really interesting, and I work a lot on this with my clients in therapy, is that oftentimes there's this sense of like, okay, if I actually speak up and say my need, I'm going to be putting essentially other people out. I'm going to be letting people down, or they're going to be mad at me. And all of that is very much indicative of people pleasing, right? It's that sense of like, I kind of need the external validation in order to feel like I'm doing a good enough job. And without that, there's this tendency to turn it inwards of, well, maybe it was my fault. My boss didn't smile at me this morning when I gave that pitch. They must have thought I didn't know what I was talking about. I must have really upset them. This sense of like, I must have caused other things externally. And something that we really work on is just recognizing like your boss and other people actually will not know what your needs are. And sometimes we think that they can mind read and that they should be able to know what your needs are. But 9 times out of 10, people are busy. People are really thinking about themselves. People are just trying to stay afloat themselves, especially right now. And so they won't necessarily know to be asking you those questions. So, actually, by doing things like asserting boundaries, like saying no, advocating for yourself, it's actually a way just to get your voice heard that you might not otherwise actually have the opportunity to do. And so if we frame it that way, it gets a little bit easier. Well, your boss might not actually know that, you're spending 13 hours on this when you're supposed to clock out at 8 hours. So how will they know unless if you actually say something?
yeah, it's really interesting hearing that context of people pleasing in a work environment because for me, and maybe for many others who are listening, and maybe many of your clients, I at least immediately jump to the social setting, right? Like people
Mhm.
pleasing by always saying yes to friends and not wanting to say no to social plans, or always saying yes to family members and not wanting to ruffle feathers in our relationship. So it's really interesting looking at it from this professional and career lens because I think you nailed it right on the head in that we don't want to say no to our boss. Like we want them to like us. That's our path to climbing our way up the ladder, right? That's the path to success. Like we can't say no to our boss or otherwise like we might get fired and like you said jump to those worst case scenarios when actually that relationship might be better off if we set those boundaries and if we say no.
It's
But the thing is, I think saying no is a lot easier said than done. So, what are some
absolutely.
ways to maybe set those boundaries
Mhm.
in a way that won't ruffle feathers, in a way that won't result in us getting fired or them, reacting poorly at all?
Absolutely. And, I think that it's really important to meet yourself where you're at because I think, with people pleasing, it tends to be very all or nothing. So I always say that worst case scenarios are usually what drive fear, right? So we might be thinking, like, oh, if I say I need to clock out at 5 o'clock, and that's just something that I'm doing for me and that's important to me, that the worst case scenario usually plays out. Like, my boss is going to be so angry, and then they're immediately going to write me up, and then I'm going to get fired. And then, everything just plays out that way. But a lot of times, like the first step is actually taking a step back and saying, it's actually not as simple as being all or nothing. In fact, what we're trying to do a lot of the time is find the gray area between the black and white. So even just recognizing, like, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen? How likely is that actually going to happen? I oftentimes tell clients to think about the realistic case scenario. So if you were to say that, let's play it out. Like, what actually would that look like? And 9 times out of 10, like it ends up being actually not the worst case scenario. And so I would recommend that you just start small and you really think about a need that feels like it might be a little bit scary to advocate for, but it's not going to be something that feels like it's so overwhelming because I think we would rather have, those little like bite sized feelings of success that really build off of themselves versus just jumping into something that feels like it's too overwhelming. So,
Mhm.
being able to take that step back and thinking, like, what's one small thing that might be able to help me a little bit in maybe feeling a little bit more balanced? And so, some things that come up a lot might be like literally clocking out on Friday, and saving things to Monday, like not checking your emails, after, let's say, 5 p.m., 6 p.m. And, a way to say that is to actually frame it as being really something that's important for yourself. And I think depending on your relationship with your supervisor or your coworkers, you can say it actually pretty casually. And in fact, sometimes like having a more casual conversation is a way to make it feel less scary.
Mhm.
So, let's say if I'm talking to my boss and it's like, oh my gosh, like, I was up, until 9 p.m. answering emails. I think tomorrow, like today, I'm really going to try to stick with finishing at 5. Usually, bosses will be very supportive of that. I think, especially since there's a push within a lot of workplaces towards mental health and wellness and balance. So, you don't have to necessarily have a script. You can really take what you would usually say, but then frame it in whatever way feels good to you, be it casual, be it a little bit more formal.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there's a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I think you touched on a couple really great things there that I want to highlight. So,
Mhm,
dipping your toe in the water, right? Starting with something maybe smaller
mhm.
and seeing how your boss reacts. And like you said, more often than not, probably 99% of the time, they're going to react positively. They're going to appreciate that you're communicating and speaking up if they're a good, reasonable manager, right? Maybe not all of them.
Mhm.
Um, and I would think, like, okay, if you have a positive response and reaction to that small need, that small thing that you're communicating, then slowly we can unlearn that fear that, oh my God, we're going to get fired. Like I have to do everything they say and not speak up because we're proving that we can express our needs and not be such a people pleaser and still be liked and still be seen in a positive light from our manager. And so I do think that's really important to highlight. And one thing that I think we do fear when it comes to people pleasing is someone reacting poorly, right? Someone emotionally reacting to us saying no or us not people pleasing, especially maybe when we have been known to people please in the past. Again,
Absolutely.
whether that be friends or whether that be our boss. So, this is another topic I really wanted to dive into with you. This idea that we are not responsible for other people's emotions and other people's reactions. Can you share a little bit about this?
Absolutely. So I think it's very classic for people pleasers, myself included, to feel like, uh-oh, it's my responsibility to make sure other people don't become upset, or I can't have them be disappointed. That's going to be my fault. And I think people pleasers have a tendency to just naturally gravitate towards shame and guilt
Mm.
as emotions. And those are oftentimes drivers of that sense of over responsibility for other people's feelings. And the thing is that, you ask someone, is someone else responsible for your feelings? Usually they'll say, no, that doesn't really make sense. Like, I have to be responsible for my own stuff. And so let's try to show the same kindness towards yourself. And I think what's really important is to actually think about what the roadblock might be to showing that kindness towards yourself. And sometimes there are a lot of different factors. Like sometimes it could be, the way that feelings were communicated within our family systems. Like if you see a parent who might be a people pleaser, really trying to be responsible for other people's feelings, as adults, we take that on, and it's something that we might have to start unlearning. So, something that's really helpful is just to remember that your responsibility is just for taking care of your own feelings. And in any situation, that's always going to be our responsibility. And in the same situation, it's the same thing for someone else. And let's say if you do advocate for a need, and let's say that your friend ends up feeling disappointed or hurt, that is not necessarily a bad thing. And actually, it's a learning moment for your friend to be able to actually sit with their feelings, to be able to communicate with you, or you can communicate with them, to talk about it. That way, there's a space to be able to just kind of like work through them. But I really find that for a lot of people pleasers, when they can really begin to sit with and internalize that sense of, oh, okay, that's not my responsibility, it can really be a sense of relief of like, oh, okay, like I don't need to be trying to caretake everyone. I just really need to be focusing and prioritizing myself.
Yeah, and I think that also can be difficult though when, let's say, someone in our life makes us feel like we're at blame, right? There's plenty of people, I'm sure we can all come up with a list in our minds, that are always pointing the finger at other people and not taking responsibility for their own feelings. And I personally have felt a lot of moments that have felt really uncomfortable and anxiety inducing when I know that someone's upset with me for vocalizing my needs and maybe saying no and communicating what I really need. And when they respond with that frustration and not being happy with me, it makes me anxious. It makes me uncomfortable because I know that they're not thrilled with me and they might not have that emotional capacity or awareness to zoom out and be like, oh, I'm responsible for my own feelings and my reactions. And there's plenty of people who just point the finger. So I do think that is uncomfortable. What would be your advice for a client, let's say, who's struggling with that discomfort of someone being upset with them when they communicate their needs?
Absolutely. I think it is incredibly uncomfortable. And actually, when we're talking about roadblocks, is probably one of the biggest roadblocks
Hmm.
that a lot of people experience to advocating for their needs. A lot of people pleasers are what I call super sensors. So they're empaths. And so they also sometimes just innately have that sense of like, Cindy is probably going to react that way. And a lot of times they're correct because they actually just know and can really read the emotional room very well. And so I always recommend that they think about not just starting small, but thinking about like if you didn't advocate for the need now, how would you feel? And actually thinking about it as being a continuation of a pattern, right? So, like, if we try to do something else, then potentially there's room for the pattern to change. And there's something that's called, this is a behavioral psychology term, an extinction burst,
Mm.
um, which is basically when you start changing a pattern, the other person is used to kind of getting what they want or having the pattern be a certain way. So the other person might actually get more mad or they might say their need a lot louder. So it's a bit of a burst that happens, But the trick here, according to behavioral psychology, is to basically not acquiesce. And actually, the other person will get over the hump and then we'll just get used to, like, okay, this is actually going to be the new norm. I always say that once the need has been stated, it's just a matter of giving yourself a ton of validation and really being able to think about your own bigger picture. Like, there's a reason why you express that need. And I think for a lot of people pleasers, sometimes it might even be getting close to a breaking point, right? And it's almost like there's no alternative but to state the need. And if that's the case, thinking about if I hadn't expressed the need, how would I be feeling right now? Like, probably
Mm,
not great. And so, in that sense, it's really, really worth it to have expressed it. And the other thing, too, is that, the more that you actually practice expressing needs, it's going to feel easier because you're
mm,
just going to begin to realize, like, oh, our friendship is still intact. Like,
mhm.
Cindy might be a little upset right now and be working through her own feelings, but it's not my responsibility to manage it for her. And over time, we were able to have a conversation and we moved forward. So there's also that positive cycle that can happen where now it's feeling like, okay, like I can do this. And that's actually a route out of people pleasing. It takes time, of course, but it's all those little moments of challenging yourself that really make a big difference.
Absolutely. I love this idea that this quote that I'm reminding myself of frequently, we can't say yes to someone else and also say yes to ourselves. Like at the
Mm,
end of the day, it's a choice when it comes to a lot of things. We can't say yes to going out with friends while also saying yes to that self-care evening in. We can't say yes to our boss while also saying yes to logging off at 5 and speaking up for our needs. And at the end of the day, I think it's always going to be a bit of a what's it called? Like a seesaw, like a give and take, right?
mhm,
And I'm reminding myself of that and that there's going to be a bit of discomfort either way we go. Either we forego our own needs and please that person, or we communicate our needs in the kindest and most confident, assured way we can, and their reaction and emotions are not our responsibility. And I love what you said too, in that the more we practice it and build that muscle, the easier it's going to get. Because as we were saying in the beginning, I think we genuinely start to unlearn these fears that are actually unrealistic. Like, is
mhm,
your friend really never going to talk to you again if you cancel the plan? Probably not. You know what I mean?
mhm.
And when you see that come to play, like, oh, I said no. They said it was fine. Let's rain check. Wait, I can do that more. Like I
Yeah.
don't have to just say yes whenever I don't want to go do that thing. Like I don't have to just give into whatever my boss wants of me. Like I'm allowed to speak up and be like, great, I'll pick that up in the morning. And I think that's just such a powerful reframe because it's all about our perspective and it's our responsibility to take a step back to see that full picture. That's an unrealistic fear that I'm convincing myself of and I'm actually allowed to say no and set that boundary.
Absolutely. That's so well put. And it's all of those little moments that really build that sense of mastery over time.
Mm,
And I think that's what's so beautiful just about giving yourself those little micro challenges. I always think about it almost like rungs of a ladder, right? And so it's like with each step that you're taking, you're actually getting a little bit higher and higher. And all of a sudden, it's going to feel like it's so easy to advocate for something that it felt so scary to do. So it just takes practice. And the other thing too is that let's say someone gets mad and then you have to go through, all those emotions that we just talked about. You also learn that you were able to handle it. And I think that's really, really powerful for a lot of people. Like, oh, I was actually able to handle that. Like, I can trust myself. I know how to manage my own feelings. I have communication skills to be able to talk through it. And actually being able to really work on that for yourself. And that, of course, has such positive implications for self worth, self efficacy, all those beautiful things that make us who we are. It can be very, very powerful.
It's interesting that people pleasing is often a product of something we picked up growing up, right? Or when we were in middle school or high school and just learned to be a part of that group setting and just being so scared of rejection and wanting to fit in so badly. I feel like we just all pick it up along the way. Like we absorb that way of living. And now as we enter our 20s and 30s, we're just slowly unlearning that. And I think it gets easier as we said with time and continuing to practice that. But I would love to learn a little bit more about what it might mean if we're people pleasers. Like if we break that down more, what is that really a sign of that's going on within us?
That's such a great question. And, I think that for every person, it can be a little bit different, right? It's actually an opportunity to maybe look back into our past and to see if we can begin to connect dots of like, where did some of these behaviors come from? And I think actually being curious about it can be exceptionally helpful of just even seeing like what patterns did I see emerging. Something that I really see in common for the people pleasers that I work with is essentially that developing sense of who they are as well as their confidence within themselves. And I think this is something that we maybe don't talk about enough for your 20s and 30s. It's a really big shift, especially if we're thinking about going into the work context, living independently, being in your first or second relationship, living in a different city. There's a lot of different huge life changes that happen, after you're a teenager going into your 20s that can sometimes lead to that sense of doubt of just figuring out like I knew this one context, which is school and, all of those friendships that you might have cultivated throughout your life. And now you kind of change everything.
Mm,
And so I think it's really common to have that sense of self doubt. And when you begin to notice that, it's also just a matter of how you approach it. Because I think for a lot of people pleasers, it's also very much correlated with perfectionism. So there's that
mm,
sense of, oh, I'm doubting myself. I don't like this. I'm used to doing something well. This feels very, very like misaligned with how I am. A way to fill that void is actually by getting some external validation.
mhm,
So I'm going to default to some of the people pleasing in order to get some of that external validation. But if we actually sit with ourselves and say, actually, let me approach this with curiosity instead of trying to fill in those gaps. It's a little bit scary for sure, but what we're really trying to do is define who we're going to be as adults. And it's a really big question. And of course, that obviously changes as we age, as we have different experiences. But if we're viewing it through that lens of curiosity, of like, I don't have to have it all figured out right away. I can actually just be curious about like what is my work self like? When am I being pulled to say yes to or not to say yes to? Who are the people I'm drawn to for dating? Like where do I think that I want to live? Actually approaching it through that curious lens kind of takes off any of the expectations that might lead to self-judgment. And when
mm.
we can do that, it's so much easier said than done. Like I definitely am a person that still struggles with that like every single day. But it's just a nice reframe of just thinking through it that lens. And it's like, if you can approach it with curiosity, you can't really do anything wrong because you're actually just trusting yourself and learning from yourself along the way.
That's such a cool perspective that in our 20s and 30s, we are really just figuring it out, right? And we're going through so much change and just discovering who we are. It's a cool way to validate that external validation that we seek and those people pleasing tendencies because we're reminding ourselves, yeah, this is just a mechanism for me to kind of grapple with this self doubt that I might be feeling or, to navigate this change to get that validation from others. And like you said, instead of approaching it from that judgmental perspective, but rather that curious perspective, takes the pressure off and just makes it a lot lighter. Like I definitely would judge myself for being like, oh, I feel like I was just being a people pleaser. That didn't really feel good when I did that. And it's easy to just feel down on ourselves for that. But maybe instead we can just notice it with curiosity, right? And acknowledge like, huh, I feel like last night when I said yes to that plan or stayed out or worked later than I would have liked to, that was me like trying to seek validation from that person or people pleasing. And maybe that's an area that I can work on building self confidence and self worth in. Like maybe that's a sign that I need to like do a little bit of work there because I notice that I keep people pleasing in that area. So I think that curiosity perspective is really powerful, and also just gives ourselves a break because, like you said, our 20s and 30s are hard and we're navigating through so much that I find myself seeking validation all the time. And I'm getting better and better at it. But I think there is no 20 or 30 something that doesn't seek external validation.
Absolutely. And, I think that it also goes to just how people pleasing is just viewed within culture right now as being something that needs to be kind of like overcome. But I think, the flip side of that is actually to really think about where it is coming from
Mm,
and that it's not inherently a bad thing at all. Right. And I sometimes view it as actually being, almost like a coping skill or like a set of behaviors that when there's a situation where it might be very uncertain, we kind of default to people pleasing because that's just what we know. But something I would recommend to people pleasers is to think of like the grand scheme of human behavior. It's one that actually is pretty effective and it's also pretty positive, right? Because I just really want to try to take out any of the shame related to people pleasing because I think
mhm,
sometimes there can be that sense of like, oh, but I'm a people pleaser. What should I do about it? It can actually lead to what we're hoping not to do, which is then kind of guilt tripping yourself into like, this is something that I have to change.
mm,
But it's also just trying to meet yourself where you're at and just embracing the fact that, it's just a pattern of behaviors, just like anything else and it's something that you're identifying that you might want to change. And isn't it so wonderful that you actually recognize that in yourself and are taking those active steps to do it? So
mm.
I would just definitely say that to people pleasers in case if they notice that little perfectionistic voice being like judgy or saying like I'm not doing this quick enough, just to say like, no, it's okay, right? Like you have a lifetime to learn about, those actions and to be learning about your sense of self as well. So there's no time frame on it.
I really like that you're reminding everyone that we don't have to identify with being a people pleaser, right? It's not an identity that we are. It's maybe a habit that we notice, right? It's maybe a coping mechanism that we've leaned on to overcome some self-doubt.
Mhm.
And I think similar to the curiosity perspective, it takes the pressure off because it's not who we are. It's something we notice about ourselves. And also it's something every single one of us do. So I think a big part of people pleasing or a big component that goes along with it can be anxiety.
Absolutely.
With your clients that battle anxiety or have anxiety that comes up when you're kind of unpacking it, what trends do you notice and what advice do you give them?
Definitely. And I think there's a really, really big correlation. Not everyone that has anxiety or might have been diagnosed with like an anxiety disorder is a people pleaser, but there definitely is a big correlation between them.
Mhm.
And I definitely notice several things. I think one is that for some of my clients that have, anxiety disorders or anxiety, a lot of it is actually physiological, and I think it's actually very important to just kind of call that out and recognize it because, what a lot of them will describe is that, when their anxiety is activated, they really feel it in their body, and so if we're thinking about anxiety as being an alarm system in our brain telling us, "Is this situation safe or is it not safe?" Um, there's an overlap that can happen with people pleasing. So if we also happen to be a people pleaser, maybe we have some social anxiety, maybe we have some more generalized anxiety. So we kind of find ourselves doing a lot of worrying about various things that our body will actually get activated in those situations. And when that happens, it can be a little bit harder to then, you know, advocate for a need or to take that step back. So I think for people that have anxiety and if they notice, they're at work and they're ready to advocate for a need, but it's like their heart's pounding out of their chest and they're having all of these rapid worries of like, my boss is going to be so mad, just to really work on using your more like I would say like coping skills, right? So they're called distress tolerant skills in therapy. So skills just to be able to calm your body down in order to get that intensity level a little bit lower. So taking a deep breath, um, even just like getting up out of your desk, going to the bathroom, splashing cold water in your face. Um, Even if you need to, just like listening to a song that you really like or just reading something really quickly on your phone, just something to help with decreasing the anxiety. And it'll make it that much easier to actually say what you were planning to say.
Mm.
So it's definitely something that we really work on a lot with, especially within therapy. And one other thing that might be helpful is actually working on those skills when you're not actually in the moment trying to say the thing that you're advocating for. So,
Mm.
actually, in day to day life, actually practicing reframing some of those negative thoughts or be journaling things so you can process them and be practicing some of those self soothing distress tolerance skills. Because the more that you're actually using them, it's just like learning how to ride a bike, like it actually just becomes second nature. And so when you are actually trying to go up a hill on the bike or you're trying to advocate to your boss, you'll just kind of default to some of those skills. So that's definitely something that I always recommend to my clients that have anxiety just to be thinking about or practicing.
Yeah, so it sounds like a physical breaking the pattern physically, right? Like the
Mhm.
breathing, the splashing water in the face, getting up from your desk and moving rather than continuing to fall down that thought spiral. I find personally that a lot of my anxiety is caused from just believing thoughts that pop into my head and then just like falling
Mhm.
down that rabbit hole
Oh
of
my
them,
gosh,
right?
same.
But then when you
Mhm.
pause and say, like, okay, this is 100% just thoughts that I'm clinging to, and when I go on a walk, or when I, like you said, practice breath work, or when I start listening to something inspiring or soothing, move my body, especially, that's a big one, I find myself pulling out of that feeling. And so it's interesting that our thoughts can really lead to those anxious feelings, even if those thoughts aren't valid. What would be one final thing you'd like to share with any Gen Z or millennial listening that you would like to shout from the rooftops?
Yeah, I would just like to say that they they're more than enough, and this is something that I just feel for all of my clients, really, that it's just like they're such wonderful people. And sometimes that little self-judgmental voice can just get in the way of truly believing and seeing what other people see about them. And really, it's so hard because we can be so kind to our friends, to everyone else, and have a lot of empathy. But then for ourselves, it can feel like there's just this block. And so I think really just would want everyone to know that you're more than enough. Like you are amazing. You're an incredible person. And it's just a matter of, doing that curiosity work. And with time, it feels so much more believable. So just keep going, and you're already doing really great.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to press follow or subscribe for more realistic and relatable shifts to live a more fulfilling life, and I'll see you all again soon.